Welcome, everyone, to this Thursday, 23rd of June, 2016. This is the MMA Beat. I'm your host for today, Luke Thomas. Of course, our intrepid host normally, Ariel Helwani, is out today, but we're keeping the train rolling as we sometimes do. Not always do, but sometimes do. At least in this case, we're going to. And happy you could join us today. So as I mentioned, I'm Luke Thomas. You can get me at SiriusXM and, of course, MMAfighting.com. To my left, making his MMA Beat debut, the one and only, Danny Segura. Bienvenidos.
Gracias.
There we are. Down the line, we have the Washington Post, Jeff Wagenheim. And then, of course, at the very end, you know him, the Chuckle Monster himself, Chuck Mendenhall from...
Let's add another nickname.
I know, for MMAfighting.com, of course, man the hat, man the shirt. All right. Welcome, everybody. So there is a lot to get to today, despite the fact there is no big UFC event this weekend. There is another big event, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the show. But let's recap some of the bigger news of the week. Specifically, speaking of Ariel Helwani, on his show this week, arguably the greatest fighter ever, Georges St-Pierre, said, you know what? I'm ready to end my roughly 3-year, what do you want to call it, sabbatical. It is now over. I am ready to come back to the UFC. Now, he mentioned some opposition, which we'll get to in a moment. But let's start with general impressions. Danny, I will open the show with you. First question, I guess, is sort of a two-parter. One, do you think this is the right time? Do you believe him that he's really ready to make a comeback? And I guess, how do you feel about it?
I think this is the right time. I think the more you wait, the older he's going to get and the worse it's going to get to come back, the harder it is. So I think this is a good time. I think GSP is a very smart guy, so I'm not opposed to him coming back. He keeps his body healthy, he's training, and, he hasn't taken damage. He has been out for a while. So
Did tear his ACL?
He did. But as far as, other like brain trauma and all that.
Getting battered in the ring, right?
Yeah, he's not getting battered in the ring, or he's not going through grueling training camps. So I think if it's a time to come back, it'd be now.
Jeff, do you agree with that?
I guess I'm accepting it. I'll say that. We've had this conversation several other times here on the show, but not with GSP saying he was going to come back. It was always us speculating whether he should come back or should he stay retired. And I feel like consistently I've always been in the camp of, hey, you walked away with the championship belt. What could be better? Your legacy is intact. Stay away. And I kind of have felt that way. But once a guy expresses an interest in coming back, he was a great fighter, and he might continue to be a great fighter. So I'll support that. I will say he did walk away at the perfect time, and it remains to be seen whether the legacy that he created, which was a pretty shining one, will get tarnished by GSP 2.0.
What an odyssey it's been in this 3 years waiting for him to sort of come to this decision where he's going to come back. He was speculating, at least at one point, if he's going to come back. He wasn't really that interested in a belt, or other people were speculating about that. He wasn't really necessarily going to do that. It was more just for big fights. Now we get into the situation where Michael Bisping is holding the belt, and suddenly he has an interest in fighting Michael Bisping, which is also symbolic because that's a middleweight title fight, and that tells you something else about how GSP is viewing his comeback, and maybe he wants to actually be a title holder again. So there's been so much that has kind of happened in this whole process, but I feel like it's finally gotten to the point where you say, okay, this is what I thought might happen the whole way. The GSP would come back and he wouldn't be content just taking normal fights, that he would want to still be fighting the guys who were in contention or have the belt, especially if Rory McDonald was not in that picture at 170 or 185, it doesn't matter. But I feel like it's felt inevitable to me for a while. So I guess I don't know if I'm just numb to the idea or if you just accepted the idea for so long, but it's a little bit exciting for me too that he wants to fight this year, and it's going to happen. If it happened against Michael Bisping and it's for a title, more power to him.
Boy, I think all three of you are crazy. Shocker of the century. I hate everyone.
Now, wait, you're hosting. You don't have an opinion. Let's go back over.
That's right. Yeah, just go right back down the line. Okay, so let me be clear about this. I do not hate the fact that he's coming back, and I will also say, I think you're right, Jeff. If you're going to come back and take time off in the way he did, the way he walked out, handing the belt to the division, to me, that's just the apex of how you do it. It really cannot be done much better than that. But I agree with you also. He didn't have these grueling training camps, although he was still, maintaining some level of physical activity. If you're going to come back, this is probably the best way to do it. Mm-hmm. But for me, I'm not confused about the appeal that people have, but as we say in Washington, D.C., I don't get sized for this at all. I don't get sized for this at all. To me, there are so much wrong with it. Number one, He is 35 years old, and for a guy who was on the decline while we could observe him, now you can attribute to some of that to the fact that he was like, I wasn't mentally all there. Okay, fine, but there was a noticeable decline. 2, this is a guy who has vocally complained about missing times in his day, which is directly attributable to brain trauma. That gives me some pause. But I think the one that gives me the most pause, besides the fact that whatever you're going to see is going to be, no matter what, a slightly downgraded version, maybe a substantially downgraded version. This Michael Bisping thing is a non-starter for me. I get why he wants it, because you can make the case now that he's the best fighter ever, but if he gets 2 titles in 2 weight classes, that changes the conversation almost overnight. This is a guy, and look, St-Pierre's record as a fighter is exemplary to the highest level. He could never fight again and already be the greatest fighter ever. But he assiduously avoided a fight at middleweight for any number of reasons, not least of which was it could take me time. This is not where I have my greatest advantage. Now, all of a sudden, he wants to come back to middleweight, having never even fought there. And you want a title shot? You better take it to another sucker. That doesn't work around this part of town.
Reinvention, man. 3 years is the process of reinvention. That's it. Come back as 185.
Just to frame the question for you, Chuck, is this not insanity?
Well, I mean, it's not insanity to me, but I get what you're saying. I mean, I get what you're saying. Like, but I feel like maybe that's just. It's been 3 years, so I'm like, a lot of the things his complaints were back in the day. Now, I agree. I just don't think he wanted to fight Anderson Silva as badly as the UFC wanted that fight and all that stuff. But his big complaint was that, he had to add muscle and all this stuff. He needed to change his body frame and change his, his training and everything to fit that shape and what he needed to be. Well, it's been 3 years, and I don't really know what he's walking around at. I don't know any of those details. I don't know if he's been actually looking at 185 for a long time or that sort of thing. But in my mind, it's like, well, you're kind of reinventing yourself if you're coming back after 3 years anyway. But just to touch on what you're saying, it's funny because besides the brain trauma, which is the thing that I don't like, he got out of it and you felt like he was pretty much intact. I don't know what else there is to prove. And
he got battered.
Yeah, and he did. He was getting beat up pretty badly in his last few fights in the UFC. But it's kind of crazy because we have such a high standard of GSP that him having competitive fights became like his decline. Just having competitive fights, not losing them. Of course, we could say they lost the Hendricks fight. So a lot of people thought he did, but you know what I'm saying? Like, he was having competitive fights, so therefore we think he's declining. But I mean, God, you just look back. I had to look back just to see, because you're reminding yourself, and you see he's had 2 losses since 2004, and the monsters he's faced in that time. And one of them was the Matt Serra getting caught, and then Matt Hughes at the beginning. It's a crazy run. I hate to see him tarnish it, but at the same time, you're like, man, he has been so good for so long. You can't help but find the appeal in that of him coming back.
And you raised the question about the immediate title shot and how silly that might seem. And I agree with you. On the face of it, it does seem absurd.
If anyone has to agree with me, it's the keeper of the oaths for title shot sanctity.
Yes, right. That is always, that's my domain for sure. However, here's a case where Michael Bisping is the champion, and we talked about this last week. Who is the obvious challenger? There's really not an obvious guy. I know last week you made a really strong case for Jacare. But Jacare's on a 1-fight winning streak. I know that a lot of people say he won the fight before that, but he didn't win it. He didn't get his arm raised at the end of it. So you got a guy on a 1-fight winning streak. And I can just tick down the list of all the other contenders in that division, and every single one of them is flawed. Then all of a sudden you bring in Dan Henderson, and that's the guy that Bisping seems to want to defend against. Well, that would be the absolute absurdity of all absurdities to bring Dan Henderson, who I don't even know if he's even ranked. Not that we pay attention
top
to UFC
15,
ranking,
but not top 10.
But that would be really insane
13,
to bring that guy in. At least with GSP, I know that you can make strong arguments against him, but at least with him, you could say he's coming back. He was the reigning champion in his division when he left, so it's kind of a backward, fight champion versus champion kind of thing. It's a weak argument.
If you're talking about Dan Henderson jumping the line, you have to then say, well, what's more absurd?
Dan Henderson has fought at middleweight.
It's true.
Dan Henderson has held titles at middleweight, not in the UFC, but in other organizations.
That's true.
Georges St-Pierre was like, I can't do middleweight. This is too big for me. Danny, am I crazy here?
No, I don't think so. And
It's okay. You can say yes if you
Yes, of
and
course.
something that's interesting, even on Ariel's show, GSP was talking about his weight. He says he's not a big welterweight, which I disagree. He's saying he's walking around 180.
But he's not a tall welterweight.
That's true.
He's sort of slightly more compact.
That's true, but I mean, he is a big guy, a muscular guy.
Right.
So going up to a middleweight, I don't know if that's a great idea. I would like to see him go and stay at welterweight. But if he does go up to middleweight, it's a good question, seeing if it makes sense to fight for the title. I don't think in the show he really made it clear that he wanted to come back and keep on fighting. For me, it sounded like a one-fight deal, or maybe a couple fights here and there, super fights. So, what if he fights Michael Bisping and gets the title?
Right.
Exactly.
What happens there?
I just feel like everybody feels.
Which would be a very good possibility.
I think Dan Henderson likes his chances against anyone. And you ask every fighter, they're gonna like their chances against someone. To me, this feels like classic Michael Bisping sliding. Oh, Michael Bisping's the champ. Now's my chance to get a title. That's what this feels like, and it feels so cynical and so thinly veiled nonsense to me. That's why I don't like it. You want a belt when you come back, St-Pierre? Okay, fine. Give him the title shot against Robbie Lawler. Now go get your title. That to me seems.
But what you just said is Bisping sliding too. It's like if you want to come back and win a title, well, win it against Lawler, which is the implication.
Win it against the weight class you told us you could only fight in forever until last week. What? Yeah. This is not an unreasonable request, I don't feel like. No. It is. Oh my God!
It's not.
I know the donks online are just thumbs down. We hate Luke.
No, it's.
I would rather see Lawler. I mean, if I had my druthers, I'd like to see that fight. But then again, we're sitting here talking about a guy who we're talking about the brain problems and like everything that we were talking about walking away, going against Robbie Lawler, who loves to just put a bashing on your brain. It's just. It feels a little cruel in that sense too. And I don't know. I'm not saying that Michael Bisping couldn't do the same thing, but somehow he likes that matchup a little better.
Well, he's really big. Yeah. Let me ask this question real quickly, and we'll move on to another part of this conversation that's related. Now, look, I can't guarantee he'll do poorly. Of course, it's a gamble, right? It's a guy who has won big at the table, saying, "All right, I got one more hand in me, or maybe one or two, whatever your point being." Okay, and that's not guaranteed that he's going to go busto. But let's say he does win. Is he the greatest fighter ever? If he beats Michael Bisping and he takes his middleweight title, does that unequivocally separate him from the pack?
I don't know, man. When you look at Anderson Silva still to this day, I still look at Anderson Silva. You look at John Jones as entering that space if he hasn't already surpassed Anderson Silva. Silva did have some guys in there that you're thinking, oh, of course he has to beat this guy. Whereas John Jones he's been going against the best that have come up the whole way through. But I felt like that was GSP for a long, sustained period of time as well. So he's definitely in the conversation to get that belt. I'm not sure, and it's no knock on Michael Bisping, but it would be the type of thing that Michael Bisping, it was such an upset for him to be where he's at. So for GSP to then go in and beat Bisping, to me, I don't know how much that would move him from where he's at, to be completely honest, in my mind.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that in order to make a big jump, I think GSP would have to come back and defeat a long reigning champion, somebody who has been at that apex for a period.
Like Anderson Silva back in the day when he avoided the fight.
But to that point also, there is a difference between the day when GSP was the reigning welterweight champion.
I'm just being difficult.
He now has been out of the game and probably has put on a little bit of weight the way he's trained. So I don't begrudge him coming back in a different weight class, but I don't think that a victory, if he were to get a victory over Bisping, would necessarily bump him past Anderson, bump him past John Jones, or some people would rank him ahead of one or more, both of those guys already. I'm not sure I would, but I think he's certainly within that top three anyway.
Danny, does it bump him up?
I don't think beating Michael Bisping definitely wouldn't hurt, and to cement his legacy as one of the best fighters in the world. But again, Michael Bisping is not a long-reigning champion. He just won his belt. So I would like to see maybe if GSP beats Michael Bisping, then defends that belt a couple of times, then maybe we can start conversating about him being the best fighter of all time.
I would flip the question on the other side though. What if he goes out there and challenges Bisping, and Bisping does to him what he did to Luke Rockhold?
Right. Just would that tarnish his legacy?
So now all of a sudden, this legacy of a guy who I was going to say retired, but walked away from a long reign in his weight class, and then comes back and continues his career in a losing way. That certainly tarnishes it to some extent. I realize that people are going to give him a pass a little bit because of the long layoff, but still, a fight's a fight. If you go out there and you lose to Michael Bisping, that's what it says in your record.
Yeah, I mean, you see guys like famous boxers of the day that come back for one fight and they'd lose. They just weren't themselves. And it didn't feel like the fight was just more of a nail in the coffin or something. It was just some kind of like, this is it. You're not who you were. And I feel like those things don't really tarnish the legacy. So if he went out there and he lost against Michael Bisping, I don't think it would tarnish his legacy. But I think it would certainly be the type of thing where you'd look at it, depending on how he did it, and say, GSP's time has passed. It would just be definitive instead of having this like, how good, where's he at, what's he going to do?
I'm with you on
So
that.
I think he would. I agree with you in a way, but I also do think he would have a little bit more to lose than say Brock Lesnar does by making a comeback from a Lesnar already before he left.
Yeah, but Lesnar never. I mean, I guess I agree with you that Lesnar never gained as much, and so that's since I agree with you. But to me, if your entire body of work is at welterweight and you did this incredible bit where you beat challenger after challenger year after year, you take time off, you come back to a brand new weight class after tearing your ACL and you get blown out. I don't know. I feel like it has no bearing on what happened at welterweight. That's just me personally.
I think that's what you're saying is the smart argument. I think that we have to also remember there's this court of public opinion that often doesn't weigh all those factors and sometimes just looks at it and says, oh, he came back, he lost, well, and they push him down. So I guess it's the difference between the pundits and the smarter fans who really can discern one legacy versus another, and then just sort of the masses who are going to slag the guy if he doesn't come back as the same guy he was.
Last word on this.
I was just going to say, like, what a strange year it's been that we're contemplating this fight at all. Like, if we were talking at the beginning of the year, who's GSP going? I mean, we would not have come up with a name like Michael Bisping. We couldn't have come up with that
Precisely.
name. We wouldn't have been talking about Diaz and McGregor ever. Well, maybe not ever, but we would not have put those two guys together, and suddenly they're fighting again. It's just what a weird year. I just feel like our matchmaking it's not strictly about the belts. It's not strictly about, you know what I mean? It's just really this. Yeah, it's more of a not a spectacle, but like a big event feel. They just want to put the bigger names together. Just what a weird year it's been.
And not just a money-weight division, it's a money-weight, like, train leaving the station division.
Yes.
Like, let's hit this now while we can.
100%.
Speaking of which, and this is, I believe GSP situation is categorically different. I do agree it's not the same thing. But the news now that Fedor Emelianenko, and I hate to even laugh, could be fighting in the UFC. Dana White even saying, I believe this week or last, people still want to see him, which is not something I dispute in any capacity whatsoever. That is a true statement. People definitely have an interest in him. And let's also be clear, since I know people are going to lose their minds about this, we're talking about one of the greatest fighters ever, arguably, at least during his time, the best heavyweight, maybe the best heavyweight ever. These are debates we can have for a separate time, but this is the caliber of fighter that we are talking about here. I mean, I can have my reservations about the GSP thing, but I can ultimately live with it depending on who he fights. The Fedor thing, to me, seems ludicrous to the highest order. This is a guy who took time off from the sport, and when he exited the sport first time, GSP exited with the title in his hands in the UFC, controversially, but beating Johnny Hendricks. Mm-hmm. Fedor was going out there against Pedro Hizzo. Okay? Takes time off and comes back against a guy who got cut from the UFC, who was a blown-up light heavyweight, and he gave Fedor the business. Okay? And that fight had been in a place where there was real officiating and would have been stopped in the first round, maybe a couple of times. Mm-hmm. This was a disaster. This was an unmitigated disaster of a fight. Okay? He has no business fighting the elite whatsoever. And I am so sick of this God-King logic of everyone saying, well, people want to see it. If you want to see Fedor fight Cain Velasquez or Junior Dos Santos, I not only question your ethics, I question your fight palate as a fight fan 100%.
You're talking about Maldonado, right? Because you said Pedro Hizzo.
Well, he ended at Hizzo, but then fought Maldonado, the blown-up like heavyweight. He got cut from the UFC.
Yeah.
Let me just put that out here. Danny, I know that the Fedor fans are going to want to stab me in the face, and that's just part of the territory. Are you one of the people whose palate I now have to question?
Hopefully not.
Which is a terrible way to ask that question, I know. Okay, reasonable people can disagrest. Where are you on this Fedor thing?
I wouldn't like to see Fedor in the UFC. I think he's way past his prime. We obviously saw it in his past 6 fights, maybe more. But if he does come back, I wouldn't like to see him against the Cain Velasquez, against the Brock, against the Fabricio Werdum. I would like to see him maybe against a Frank Mir, someone that's not a big puncher, someone that is sort of at the same level.
Derek Lewis.
Yeah, that's a great fight.
That'd be horrible. Yeah. But someone with a big name that's sort of in the same point of their career. I think Frank Mir would be good. I think Bigfoot Silva would be good.
To your point, if I'm not wrong about this, are Frank and Fedor roughly the same age? I think they're like both 39.
Yeah, they're about the same age, yeah. All of them are the same age.
Yeah, well, all right. But okay, to your point, if it was someone who was more along the same career arc, you'd be okay with it.
I'd be okay with it, yes.
Well, here's your problem, Luke.
I got many problems, Jeff.
You were pointing out to me that I'm the guy who's all about the meritocracy and this and that. Well, your thing always has been, is this UFC worthy fighting, and you've complained about that a lot, but that term has become kind of irrelevant. I mean, our friend Ben Folks wrote a really nice column over at MMA Junkie this week where he basically dissected that whole idea, and really 2 words: CM Punk. I mean, the fact that the UFC would sign a guy who really is not a UFC quality fighter because he can bring eyeballs to their promotion, that's the new world order for this fight promotion. So the idea that Fedor would or wouldn't be UFC quality is kind of an irrelevant thing. But I will say that after seeing him take that beating, my first reaction was, well, at least this means he's not going to sign with the UFC. But then when I heard Dana White react to it, and instead of like little smiley face or some kind of snarky
Fedor's got a great chin.
He said he has a great chin, which says that we're going to sign this guy.
Look at how Stipe Miocic walked through Maldonado, right? Like, we always have to do these references about the guys who are in their like opponents, and you just look at that fight, and you look at maybe even Quentin Rampage Jackson, who was wrapping his knuckles on Maldonado as well, and it's just they didn't really have a problem, you know. And I just with Fedor, it's like, you know, he went in for the early kill. He gets so incautious in his offense. It's like he always takes punishment because he just starts to throw crazy, you know, like he's trying to end the fight. I just don't know how that's going to translate. Now, it's possible he could go in there and knock somebody out. We all know this is the case. He could do that, but more than likely you're going to see some version of what we just seen. Personally, if he's going to come in, I know he's a smaller heavyweight. I would love to see if he could get down to 205 pounds. If he couldn't do that, it would be like, maybe this is the land of exceptions. We're doing the whole thing with Justino and everybody else. You know, not everybody else, but Justino, we've been making an exception. Maybe you make some kind of catch weight of like a 215 pounder or something like that. I just think maybe you need to look at that, because I think he's a little undersized too to go against some of the beasts that are in the UFC's heavyweight division right now. Even though they've been around as long as him, and even though he's faced some of those guys, at this point in his career, I agree with you. I get a little queasy, like kind of contemplating how he would match up against those guys.
But is it in the UFC's interest to give him a matchup that's going to build him up? I think that Dana White has shown himself over the years. I know now he's saying, what a great chin the guy has, but you're looking back at every comment he's made about Fedor historically, he's always been kind of, you know, downgrading the guy. So now he has an opportunity to prove himself right, in a sense, by signing.
Anytime you're praising their chin,
right? You sign the guy.
That's the Homer Simpson qualification.
Yes,
right.
exactly.
So Dana now can, in his mind, prove himself right by signing the guy, bring him in, give him a tough matchup, watch him get knocked out, and then like basically say, yeah, this is the guy you said was the best heavyweight ever. You know, I mean, I know that logic doesn't hold water, but we've seen a lot of things this guy has said that have not held water.
Yeah, that's definitely possible, and I don't see them trying to build up Fedor. I mean, how much more can you build up Fedor? Fedor already has his career. He did what he did. So building him up in the UFC and getting him sort of easy matches to turn him into a star, I don't see that happening.
I just feel like these guys, the fans, and I get it, man. You know, that's why they get mad when you criticize them, because they have such these profound like attachments to the people of these figures of adoration, like Fedor, like St-Pierre. And again, I don't think their situations are identical. I'm just bringing it up because they're both talking about these UFC fights that they could potentially be having. And I feel like at some point you have to ask yourself as a fan, and everyone's going to have different answers to this. There's this, what could reasonably happen on the good side, and how many questions are there? And for me, with St-Pierre, I agree I don't like it, but I can admit it's debatable. With Fedor, I feel like it's this, like the questions about his health, that he hasn't complained about missing hours in his day, because no one's really probably asked him about it. He wouldn't say it. You know how much abuse that guy has taken? He mentioned Antonio Silva. I was there when Antonio Silva beat the brakes off of Fedor. And this was what, 5 years ago this happened?
It really is like one of those things. I think it's like a romanticism of fans, right? Like to say, like, we've never seen this guy in the UFC, and it still holds, right? Like everybody just wants to see.
That's a
him
very
in the UFC.
alluring thing,
it is,
but it's
100%.
dangerous.
It's come at such a weird time. Now, I still think it gets done. I think we're going to see him in the UFC. I just hope that it's not. That's what I'm saying. I get a queasy thinking of him in those situations where he's fighting a guy who could do a lot worse than a guy like Maldonado did, or do a lot worse than even Bigfoot did. You know what I'm saying?
How much more could you do to the guy than what Maldonado did, really? And that's a light heavyweight.
Maldonado's like, get out there and mow my lawn. And Fedor's like, all right, I guess I have to go mow your lawn. I just feel like we're going to get to a point where it's going to be weekend at Bernie's, where we're holding these guys up with the last bit of KT tape we can find and shoving them out there.
I don't know how it was for the New Jersey show, like when he came out, and just the general feel of the building when he came out. But it was hallowed.
For the Antonio fight?
Yeah, because he had lost by that point.
It was thousands of Russians in attendance.
Yeah,
thousands.
I saw him, back in the Affliction days, both those fights against Arlovsky and Tim Sylvia. I saw him a couple of times in Strikeforce before he lost. Like, he's still riding this decade-long streak, and it was just one of the most unique atmospheres because he had such a hallowed presence to come in there, and he was coming in with his music and everything. I have to say that the guy really had transcended the sport for a while there, at least in a global sense, in some sense, like, wow, this is what the sport is. This is crazy. So that part of me, there's still that in there. So I have to say that, but man, I've watched him get beat up plenty in the last couple of years, and I don't know. I'm really mixed on that whole thing. I just hope that they do the right thing. Give him a guy, like you said, somebody who would make sense for where he's at right now.
Yeah, they give him Frank Mir, but thanks, USADA.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on from that before people charge in here and hit me in the face with a hockey stick. Okay, so there were some good things that happened this past weekend. The UFC went to Ottawa. There were a number of notable results, especially for that welterweight division in 3 different ways for 3 different fighters. Let's quickly go through those if we can. First one of which, I should say, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Now, not the most scintillating performance, Danny, but nevertheless dominant in really every way you could basically ask for. Rory McDonald, I had Carlos Condit on my radio show, and Carlos Condit was like, the interesting thing about Rory McDonald is he's a chameleon. He can fight a number of different ways for different guys. And I feel like he had some game plans in mind, and none of them really worked. Wonderboy Thompson even thought he was going to come out. He told me he was going to come out and charge him, and saw this look that Roy was giving him, and decided to change his whole game plan before the very first punch was thrown, and did it successfully. So let me ask you, Wonderboy Thompson, Demian Maia, who gets the title shot?
Wonderboy. I think Wonderboy's on a longer streak. He's just alone Rory McDonald and Johnny Hendricks. Those are two huge wins. Demian Maia also hasn't been in main events or co-main events. I don't feel like has that much light on him, so I don't think the fans will really root for him as much as they would for the Wonderboy. I feel like Wonderboy has a lot more momentum going, so I can see the UFC giving Wonderboy a title
Let me
shot.
reframe this question for you, Jeff. I agree with Danny. I don't think you can make a stronger case for Demian, but I will say there is this momentum behind Wonderboy that I feel like is tied to the fact that people just like the way he fights better. No?
Well, he's fun to watch. There's no question about it. But I don't know. I mean, I hate to. I'm not a jiu-jitsu practitioner. I don't train in jiu-jitsu, but watching Demian Maia is just magic. I mean, so I can't say that one of those two is better at his craft than the other. If anything, maybe you would make an argument that Demian Maia is a better jiu-jitsu guy than Wonderboy as a karate guy. But it is really exciting to watch Wonderboy, the way he competes. I would have given him a title shot after the way he handled Hendricks. So this was a bonus. I thought, wow, they're really putting an obstacle. The guy who earned what I thought was earned a title shot in his last fight. Now they're going to give him, the guy who might be the second best guy in the division. And look what he did. I mean, he utterly confused Rory McDonald for that whole fight. It was an impressive performance.
Yeah, I mean, I liked the performance, honestly. It was fun to see him playing out tactically and watch Rory's different things and see him basically adjusting, seeing Wonderboy adjust to what was going on. Mm-hmm. And he even mentioned, like you said, he had to adjust. I feel like that's another component that he brings. He's just a very smart fighter, I feel like if he fought a guy like Demian Maia, that would be a very interesting fight because you have such, sublime disciplines clashing in there. And you'd love to see that at some point, but I don't want to kill off one of the contenders. But I think Wonderboy has got to be the guy, too, just in the way that he's, both of those showings. I know, like, some people he didn't get a finish in this last fight, but look at the state he left Rory McDonald in a pretty tactical and subtle way. Like, it wasn't as splashy as what he did to Johnny Hendricks, but man, that guy he has that feel. Like when John Jones was coming up, he had that look of a guy who's inevitable, like Khabib Nurmagomedov. He's kind of coming up, he has the feel of a future champ. To me, he has that feel. So you want to see him get a shot to see if that hunch is correct. And regardless, who he fights, but I think that a fight with him and Robbie Lawler would be a lot of fun. You can contemplate how that would go down, and it's a lot of fun to think about.
Of course, Demian Maia is older, and so you hate to see a guy who's still fighting really in his prime, but is at probably the later end of his prime, and you hate to see that guy not get his chance to shine. But the line is the line, and I think that Wonderboy is the guy who's pushed his way to the front of it.
All right, so Jeff, let's flip the script a little bit if we can. The guy who he defeated, Rory McDonald, notably fought out his contract, made a very public, I won't say stink about it, but certainly there was public notice about it. Now, we've seen guys successfully do it. Dan Henderson fought out his contract twice with the UFC, and we'll see, well, the last just this once in the UFC 100. We'll see how that goes. Alistair Overeem just did it very successfully. Even Aljamain Sterling did it, but it didn't quite go his way. We've seen others fight out their contract and it not go their way. Rory McDonald, where is he going to end up, and how much is he going to get paid? Because that was the big thing that was really bothering him. Now I don't know what's going to happen to him.
Yeah, I wonder too. He won't get paid as much as he would have if he had won that fight. I can tell you that. And
Did he miss his boat? Is he never going to get paid?
well, he's a young guy, and if he can come back and build himself back up, he can get paid. But he does need to do some building, because right now he did not show himself to be on the same level as Wonder Boy. And he did show himself to be on the same level as Lawler, but he ultimately got beaten up for it. And don't forget, he was winning that fight against Robbie Lawler until he got knocked out. So it's not as though he is, pushed down and out of the top 10 and somewhere off in obscurity, but he still is below those guys. And then you bring in a guy like Demian Maia, who's waiting in the wings for a title shot. So you've got to figure that Rory McDonald is going to have a while to wait in order to get back to where he needs to be. Yeah. That might not be a bad thing, because he has taken a beating, and he might need a little bit of that regrouping. But in the short term, where he has to find a place to fight, I would imagine that the folks over in Viacom are going to come looking for him to join Bellator, but I don't think that they're going to come looking for him with a red carpet that they might have had otherwise.
I don't think the UFC is going to let him get away, to be honest. I know he's rubbed them the wrong way. He's been very public. You can tell there's not exactly a fuzzy thing going on between those guys. But then again, he still is, like, they just did an event in Ottawa because he's Canadian. He's main eventing a card. He still represents a market for them. And I feel like that's more valuable than just his wins and losses. Plus, it's not like he was non-competitive in that fight. I mean, and like you mentioned, he was beating Robbie Lawler. He was that close to becoming the champion. So I feel like the UFC is going to recognize all those, and they're going to reach some kind of agreement. And I think Rory will eventually meet him. They'll meet in the middle somewhere to figure that out. But I really can't imagine him doing like what Benson Henderson or a couple of these other guys have done and going to Bellator. For some reason, I just can't see the UFC letting that one get away.
Danny, you agree?
Yeah, now call me crazy, but I think he can actually get maybe even a better contract than the one he had before. I know he's coming off a loss, but just the fact that he can go to Bellator is a pretty big deal. I mean, we saw the UFC signed back Mirko Krokop just so he wouldn't go to Bellator. I mean, yeah, I don't really see them letting go Rory McDonald. He's a top guy. He generally puts very exciting fights, and he's still young. I think he still has a bright future ahead of him. So I don't see them letting go Rory McDonald.
Here's a question for you, Danny, and I agree that the Bellator option at least helps him a little bit. Not quite what it would have been had he won, because then it's like, well, you have to re-sign him basically at that point. What are there really fights in Bellator you want to see with him, with Rory McDonald? Like, Rory McDonald versus Benson Henderson, I guess you could do, maybe. Rory McDonald versus Andrei Koreshkov, that would be a fun fight.
That would be fun.
I guess Michael Page, they used to train together a little bit, but I guess you could do it. But, there's not a ton of awesome choices, right?
It's hard to see Michael Page getting that fight.
Yeah,
until he fights some other names, or somebody with a half a name.
No, besides Benson Henderson and Koreshkov, I don't really see him getting any other fight. There's nothing really appealing there. So I can totally see him wanting to sign back with the UFC.
Also, but you mentioned before, Chuck, that the Canadian market's important to them. Bellator's on the move too. It's not like they don't want some Canadian options, right?
That's true.
Yeah, that's true. I just think that the UFC does prize, when Benson Henderson was kind of coming up, you didn't truly get the feeling the UFC was overly concerned about losing him. I feel like they'd be concerned about losing Rory McDonald, and they usually win that battle.
They certainly do. All right, and the other third welterweight, it's funny to talk about him this way. Donald Cerrone goes out there and just puts the beat down on Patrick Cote, a guy who previously fought at light heavyweight on short notice against Tito Ortiz. Even dropped Tito Ortiz once in that fight. Folks forget about that. And he got taken to the woodshed. It was incredible. And so after the fight is over, UFC President Dana White says, after Donald Cerrone had complained that I guess I don't mean S to the UFC if I don't get paid, my paycheck reflects the fact that I must not mean a whole lot to the UFC. And Dana White says, well, you got paid $200,000 roughly, and this was a $900,000 gate, and he's inconsistent. And I'm thinking to myself, if there is one guy who is the model of athletic excellence and consistency, it is Don. Like, calling Don Cerrone inconsistent, it'd be, if you wanted to say, well, he can't beat the very best guys in his division or the other one up, okay, I can buy that. That's not inconsistent. That's just a limit to how good you are, and a very understandable, forgiving one at that.
Well, in Commissioner White's defense, Cerrone had not fought in a long time. He was on a long layup. He had not fought since February.
Right.
So maybe he had forgotten all about that guy. He is a guy that, he must have shown that ring rust again in this last fight. So, there's the context for the whole thing.
But Danny, what do you make of these kinds of comments? Like, he calls him inconsistent, which is just, it's like calling him short. No, he's not short. No, like, just no. Like, he is tall enough to ride this ride. When you heard those comments, and not only just Cerrone's comments, his frustration, but then the UFC's response, what was your thought about it?
Yeah, I think it's ridiculous calling him inconsistent. The guy's won 10 out of 11 fights. It seems the only fights he loses are those really top ones that you mentioned. So if anything, he's consistent.
But let's not lose sight of what Dana White is here. He's not a pundit. He is not a guy who we go to and say, hey, Dana, what do you think of this guy's fight? What about this guy's game? That's not his job. His job, he is a promoter, and he, as a promoter, has to sign or promote the fighters. And so if he's going to have a guy complaining about something, he's got to have a response to that. And his response doesn't need to make sense, Luke. It does not need to make sense.
Well, that's a relief.
It just has to be put out there, because there are enough people out there who are going to listen to it and buy it.
If anybody should talk about getting a raise, maybe it should be Donald Cerrone, a guy who's been there for them, for years. I mean, he fought 5 times in 2011. He's fought like 14 times in the last 3 years. I mean, or something like that. I think he fights 2 more times, which seems inevitable. He will be fighting on average 4 times a year.
That is insane.
Yeah, it's insane. And he's a guy who has a great aesthetic, like, people are excited to watch him fight. He's a great interview. He's all those things. He doesn't take a ton of damage usually. I mean, like, he's one of those guys. We saw, really, he's only lost, like you guys mentioned, at the top. The guys at the top, and that's twice against RDA. And I think Anthony Pettis, I don't even know who before then.
Nate Diaz got him.
Oh, Nate Diaz. And that's the one where he took like 500 punches that fight. That was the one time I saw him really get beat up consistently over the thing. But if you just look at his resume, you're just like, man, if anybody should maybe be talking about, especially in light of Diaz kind of making a stink and for more money. And maybe it is Donald Cerrone, a guy like that. You know what I'm saying? Like, he might not be the biggest draw, but he's one of those guys who does everything else perfectly.
He's also the guy who, every time the UFC has a fight fall apart, who's the guy who steps up?
Right. It's not just how many times he's fought.
Yeah.
How many times has he tried to fight and been denied?
Yeah.
Right. That's the other part that you think about. But, like, to me, Cerrone feels very much like this mix between McGregor and Diaz. And here's what I mean. We had mentioned before that McGregor was one of these guys that was hand in glove for their promoter, just a dream. You give him a stage and just let him do his thing, and bam, off he goes. And Diaz was the opposite, right? A guy who almost fought against you a little bit. He's hard to promote, but once you put him on that catalyst rocket ship, off he goes too. I feel like Cerrone must be looking around and being like, wait, if Nate Diaz can be this popular, I can be this popular, and I'm not this popular. 100%. And I don't know exactly how he gets from A to B, because we know how Diaz did it with McGregor. Yeah. Not everyone can feud with McGregor in that way, although he has a little bit.
Yeah.
But I feel like these guys are waking up to the fact that, like, in a different world, Danny, I can be much bigger than I am.
He has groundwork on those things, though. Like, both those names you mentioned, he has an in with both those fights at some point.
Yeah, but I feel also he's starting to realize, like, all these fighters are making money. Nate Diaz is making money, and he fought Nate Diaz too. And he's been there for the company. He stepped up on short fights. He's never really been critical towards the UFC. Diaz has in the past, and McGregor a little bit. So he's starting to see, I've been playing everything by the book and doing everything right, and yet these guys are, getting the big paydays. I want to get a part of that too.
He's had, I believe, a dozen end of the night bonuses. So in his own way, he's been making money on that level.
He's so inconsistent with it. He doesn't win a bonus every time. It's amazing.
Well,
but that tells you about what kind of fighter he is when he has 12 of those.
But
things,
Donald Cerrone's pocketbook is at the mercy of the UFC and who they're going to give a bonus to at the end of the night. And I think that's one of the things he's starting to notice. I don't think it's any coincidence that right after Forbes released its list of the top 100 athletes in terms of the amount of money they made, and the only MMA fighter to be on there was was Conor McGregor. I think it was number 85. He made the same amount of money as David Ortiz of the Red Sox. I mean, that's a lot of money. These other fighters are starting to realize, because we've always heard about McGregor bragging about the money he makes, but so much of what he talks about sounds like bluster, and we think, well, he's just building up his own pocketbook. But now, when you see a reputable media source tell you that this is the amount of money this guy's making, and you're a fighter and you're one of the top guys in the game, and you're like, hey, I could do that.
Donald does like to spend money, man. He likes to go out and spend his money as fast as he can make
I'm not saying that whatever they pay him won't go out the door just as fast, but that's not the point.
Yeah,
the point is, are you being fully compensated?
Yeah.
By the way, you saw who McGregor was less than on that list, didn't you?
Who?
James.
Oh, James, of course.
Here we go. All right, let's move on to something. It's semi-related to McDonald, and I don't even know how to talk about it because no one's really talking about it. It's a little weird. So today is Thursday. Tomorrow is Bellator 157 Dynamte 2. How do we feel about this one, huh? This is a little weird. I was at the first one. I thought that it was I appreciated the ambition that Scott Coker brought to Dynamite and brought to Bellator. If you had seen the Rebney days, it was very much like, what's the smallest casino we can pack 4 people into, not including the judges? And it's like, okay, I mean, I guess this set, really, this set housed Bellator 50, that's what I know. And Coker thought bigger about it, and I really appreciate that. I wound up thinking that there was a problem with the sound system when I was there, and it just was too much. So now they're going to try it again. And now they have their own kickboxing brand and their own thing. So Chuck, I'll start with you on this one. Are you pumped for it? Like, what's your general? There's no wrong answer here. So how do you feel about it?
Pumped's a big word. I don't know about that one. I guess I'm intrigued. I guess would be the word. You were at the first one. I know we've had conversations about that a little bit. I'm still not sold on the combo. These combo nights like this. For some reason,
the kickboxing and the MMA.
Kickboxing and the MMA, like, for some reason, I want to watch one or the other. And generally speaking, I like mixed martial arts. I don't really watch kickboxing just for fun. You know?
And just if I may, for clarification, because this confused me too, there's the Dynamite card, which is both MMA and kickboxing, followed by a kickboxing card that's just kickboxing.
And that's what I'm saying. It's just a little too confusing for your viewing pleasure. In my mind, I'd rather just watch mixed martial arts. When it's a mixed martial arts event, I'd like to just watch mixed martial arts. But I agree. The word ambitious, I feel like that's really what they're doing. Maybe they're just gauging it and seeing how, let's try it more than once, see if if it gains traction over time. I would say I'm intrigued on that level just to see how it all plays out. But in terms of the fights themselves, like at the MMA events, there's it's kind of cool. You got Rampage kind of showing back up. He's not going against he's going against Ishii. It's it should be a win for him.
Is that fight really any worse than Rampage versus Maldonado?
It's not. That's exactly right. It's like on that level. Hopefully we get the EFN announcer for that one as well, though. But
that'd be fantastic.
And then of course you get Matt Mitrione, and there's a couple intrigues on there. So I would say
we'll break those down in just a second. But your general view is like,
I'm intrigued, I guess.
Jeff, you tepid on it?
The gimmick doesn't throw me. I will say that the first time that Bellator put a boxing ring, or kickboxing I should say, and a MMA cage in the same arena next to each other, the visual of that was pretty spectacular.
It's cool
and I liked watching it. But then when I started watching the event, now I wasn't there, but I was imagining that if I were there and had a great seat for this MMA fight in front of me, all of a sudden I'm way, way far away from that boxing match, and I'm even pointing in the wrong direction. So it seemed like logistically, it's something that's built for a big pop and a thing where people are going to say, wow, look what they did. And the picture of the two rings or the two venues together might be an interesting picture to look at. But the actual event itself, if you're a big MMA fan, there are probably a few people who love MMA and love kickboxing, but there are a lot more people who love one and don't care about the other, and it can go either way. There are a lot of kickboxing fans who don't give a damn about MMA, and MMA fans vice versa. I don't think it's necessarily going to be. I have no idea anything about the kickboxing matches this week. I don't even know one person who's in them, but I have paid attention.
Glad to see you did your homework, Jeff.
But I have paid attention to the MMA guys. I mean, really, that's because that's what I'm interested in.
Dan, let me reframe the question for you, because I think Jeff actually speaks for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
They can probably name, Rampage, Mitrione. They don't really know. I mean, if I said Joe Schilling was on the card, you know Joe Schilling.
I do know him, yes.
Right. But he's on the kickboxing portion, not the Dynamite portion.
Yes,
whatever. It's so
that's where
stupid. But what's Coco really supposed to do? Like, he can't compete with the roster. Maybe he can build some stars through kickboxing. Is that the worst idea?
I don't think so, but it's interesting that he's doing both kickboxing and MMA. I'm an MMA fan, not really a kickboxing fan, and I know there's some people that are kickboxing fans and not MMA fans. So to build a star through kickboxing, that's very difficult to do and to bring over to MMA. So I think that's very confusing. I agree with you guys.
It's tough too, because if you, regardless of how you we're going to take a specific discipline. I understand why kickboxing, it has a lot more to it. There's knockout potential and all that. But if you said, we're going to have a jiu-jitsu match that just basically, a Metamoris is going to combine with it. It wouldn't make sense either, would it? I mean, there's something about the sensibility. There's something about the all-access thing about mixed martial arts, and that's the true allure, right? You just don't know how it's going to play out on the ground, on the feet, all these things. And I think that these things, when you have that mindset, it's very tough to then say, we're going to watch a restricted version of this over here. You know what I'm saying?
That's an interesting way to frame it, though, because I don't think kickboxing fans would view it as such.
Well, 100%. But I'm saying
MMA
as
fans
an MMA
might.
fan, because I feel like MMA fans we're trying to bring the one to the MMA.
They don't
fans.
kickboxing fans don't view kickboxing as a lesser of things.
Right.
But
Yes.
MMA
But
fans certainly might.
Yes.
Yeah, but I think kickboxing, boxing, jiu-jitsu, all those things, an MMA fan's gonna be waiting for the jiu-jitsu guy to throw a ground and pound punch when he's on top position. Like all those, you just get programmed to watch the sport the way you watch the sport. But I think to speak to what Chuck just said, I can understand if Bellator were to try to build these two products separately and get to a point where there's a natural intersection where you've got a lot of momentum and maybe Joe Schilling is just kicking ass in the kickboxing ring, one fight after fight, and then you've got a guy who's really dominant in the MMA, and you then put both of them on the same card, and that might be something that's interesting. But I think they've built up MMA to some extent, but they really haven't built their kickboxing at all yet, and it's almost like it's dragging it down in a sense. It makes it a little bit less interesting for me.
So when I was there, a lot of the folks complained that the matches, I can remember at the time it was Glory, which of course is no longer on Spike. It's not part of the Viacom family, at least in any capacity. And the matchups they created was Paul Daly versus Fernando Gonzalez, and it was Carrie Ann Taylor versus just somebody they found at a gym, it appeared, which is fine. She's at that level. That's not that unusual, actually. I'm not criticizing it in that way, but just pointing out. This time they bring back Melendez, Carrie Ann Taylor Melendez, and they bring back Joe Schilling. It's a rematch from a Bellator fight, which I think is kind of interesting. Here's my point: I think attitudes will change if the kickboxing fights are hot, but if they're even moderate or cold, then it brings down the whole thing. And MMA fans aren't as forgiving of that as they might be forgiving of a so-so MMA fights. That's the challenge. The kickboxing part has no room for error. So that's kind of how I feel about it. But I do think if it's hot, people will respond to it.
It's also just confusing, right? I mean, it's just confusing when they have that many things
like
going on.
Bellator, when they announced Schilling versus Kato, I had said it was part of Bellator 157, and Bellator staff reached out to me. They're like, no, it's part of the kickboxing card. I'm like, right, Bellator 157. They're like, no, there's another card after that. I'm like, what are y'all doing?
But is the other card in the same venue as well?
Yes. And it starts as soon as Dynamite ends.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, it's like they really haven't put things in the right order.
Yeah. And then there's just going to be a dance-off between all the fighters. I don't understand. All right, but let's talk about some of the guys on the card just real briefly if we can, because it is kind of interesting. Number one, the one I want to start with, we'll get to Rampage in a second. Matt Mitrione is making his Bellator debut. I have to say, Matt Mitrione...
Who's he fighting, Luke? Let's hear it.
Carl Seyumana-Tafa.
Okay. Wow. Seyumana-Tafa 5 times.
Good for you, man.
Tuiasa Sopo from Washington State. Okay. You can make whatever you want of the fight. The fight is not particularly interesting, but you talk to Matt Mitrione, he has become unbelievable at interviews. He is a guy who has finally said, I'm going to do the things that come about with taking my career seriously and getting paid the right way. This is what it's supposed to look like, right? Guys making choices, and maybe they're different ones. How do you feel about Matt Mitrione's choices? Like, I kind of feel like he's got the Bellator kickboxing gig. I don't know what he's going to get paid, but presumably it's decent. He seems to be happy. I'm kind of happy for him.
Yeah, I'm happy for him too. I mean, ultimately, he's a guy who's only fought in the UFC. We only know Matt Mitrione with the UFC. It's kind of one of those crazy situations. Nobody really comes up that way. So for him to then go somewhere else at this point of his career, there's intrigue in that too. Just the the fact that he's going to be operating on a whole different, with a whole different crew. I was at the Benson Henderson debut against Korshkov at Mohegan Sun, and it was just weird to watch Benson Henderson coming out to the Bellator cage with their whole setup, their production, everything else. It just feels a little bit foreign and novel, like to see something like that. And I kind of anticipate
that first time.
Yeah, the
that
first time. So I feel like we've got that a little bit, right? Like we're going to see him in this new situation, and I like that sort of thing. It's always when somebody crosses a partition and goes somewhere else. It's always got that sort of allure.
You said that people only know Mitrione from his days at the UFC. I always think of him as a star defensive lineman for the New York Giants.
Well, you're a hater. You're an unbelievable hater.
Was he on the practice squad or something?
No, he played.
Yeah, real easy to make in the NFL. You two chuckleheads over there.
No, actually, I think Mitrione actually has come a long way. I remember him very well from when he was. Every time he opened his mouth, he would say something really stupid. Like the whole Fallon Fox thing was one of the ones I remember very well, and I remember writing a really critical column about his real stupidity. I mean, he is a guy who is very loose with his words, but I think being loose with his words has actually become more of a benefit to him in recent years because I think he's a really good interview. He's an interesting guy.
I think he's matured as a person too.
Well, perhaps, or at least he's learned how to project his maturity more than he used to.
Danny?
I think this is a good move for him. Going into Bellator now, he's got his sponsors back, which I know that's.
Are you excited about it though?
I mean, it depends who he's facing. Carlo, how do you pronounce?
Seyu Manu Tafa.
I'm more interested in him making his Bellator debut, and the fact that it's his first fight outside of the UFC. That's what's appealing, not the actual matchup. So in a way, I am excited to see him fight in Bellator. But as far as like the fight itself. No, I'm not excited for that.
Let me roll right back to you. Then there's Rampage. You ever had that kid in high school who ran away from home and they just brought him back? You're like, oh, he's back. He ran away from home for a week. I feel like that's Rampage. He ran away from home and now he's back in Bellator. He's fighting Satoshi Ishii. He seems to be in a mostly pleasant mood about things, given how everything turned out. He got a freebie over there in the UFC. Worked things out. Are you excited about? I guess it's the return of Rampage.
I mean, Rampage always puts on fairly exciting fights. I think, a good matchup here with Satoshi Ishii. I think that's going to be exciting. So I think it should be fun, and I'm excited to see Rampage return. We've sort of, this whole contract dispute. It's been holding Rampage back, and I kind of just want to see him fight. So I'm glad everything's worked out, and he's back in Bellator.
Okay, fair enough. Jeff, excited for Rampage?
Not really. Quentin Jackson used to be a guy who lived up to that nickname Rampage. I haven't seen a lot of rampaging in his fights in recent years, and I don't know. Will we see some of that this weekend? We'll see, but I'm not anticipating a lot of it.
Chuck, ready for Slam Page?
I wanted to. It just seems sort of arbitrary how they came up with his opponent in this. I guess I feel like there are names they could have put him in. He was calling for titties. What's that guy's name?
Daryl Schoonover.
Yeah, I was almost like. That's almost too perfect to not put together.
I believe, Chuck, I believe this is the first time we've used the word titties on the show.
I couldn't remember his name, but that's what he calls them.
Wow.
So, I mean, in my mind, if you're going to do the novelty type fights, you're just going to do these fights that don't maybe do something like that.
This is the place Fedor's supposed to be.
It's true.
These are the ones.
It's true.
If Fedor was fighting Carl Seyu Manu Tafa, I'd be like, all right, whatever. I mean, it's still a risk, But this is, for me, it's like there's very little risk for Rampage and there's very little risk for Matt Mitrione.
Then again, I would say if I lack anticipation of seeing him, he always makes up for it when you actually do see him. When you're watching him come out and he's howling and he's got his chain on and everything, it always has this like, oh yeah, there's Rampage. It always has that feel for me a little bit. But I feel like I'll be more revved up as I see him going out to the cage than I will be in the build-up to it. I don't know why. I don't know if it's just the opponent. I don't know if it's because he's been, kind of taking it easy, doing all these things, going back and all this stuff. So
I feel like it's been a quiet media cycle for him too.
Yeah, it has.
It's a little bit interesting. All right, a couple more things we want to get to with the time we have remaining. Number one, we're now seeing we had the early weigh-ins for two UFC events ago. I forget where it was, California, right? If I'm not mistaken. UFC 199, Inglewood. Yep. Then in Ottawa we had it again. Now it looks like Nevada is going to be trying it. This is the interesting part to me. I think we're all basically in favor of it. I don't think anyone's like, dehydrate those suckers. But everyone talks about we can't really make changes to the unified rules because you'd have to go state by state, and it would really take time. Now, I'm not saying we need to go through and like just scrap everything with the unified rules or the 10-point must system. We have to make something, someone have to have a good idea. But it turns out if you have a good idea and the UFC gets behind it, they can push it through as often as they need to in every territory they go to. Is that not the lesson here, Jeff, of this early weigh-in rule?
And you mentioned the magic word, 10-point must system, or magic term, because that's the one that has probably plagued this sport more than most things, really, right? So many decisions where we're puzzled by what the judges come up with. And it turns out that the judges are looking at things a lot differently from the way you would look at things and the way I would look at things. And also, these fights often are 3 rounds, and there's not much room for error. And it's a system that works really beautifully in boxing. It's not a system that works very well in MMA. But, we can't change it because it's part of the unified rules. And I think you make a great point. These things can change if someone has something better to offer.
Kudos to Andy Foster, right? Like this is. I feel like these are the
Andy
types.
Foster.
Yeah, it's like it's.
You were talking to him on the phone.
It's cool that it's cool to see something like this, especially because these things have gone on too long, you think. When you think about it, I know Ariel is fond of saying, we'll look back in 20 years and we'll be like, wow, we were living in the old West back then. There was all these, can you imagine that being the case? I feel like there's still a lot of that going on. Like you mentioned 10 months, there are a lot of things that are just, they've never been satisfactory. And I think that the weigh-ins has been one of them. I mean, we've seen so many incidents at weigh-ins. We've seen so many guys come in over. We've seen Barao, that whole thing when he kind of got hurt, and you know what I mean? Like just people just doing these crazy things to make weight, and I feel like this facilitates and it makes people healthier come fight night. And I feel like that's really all you want to do in this sport. But it is interesting how fast this has caught on. I do dig that.
I mean, to play devil's advocate a little bit, the weigh-ins thing, I mean, it's just a matter of time, right? You're just switching time, so it's...
You're just shortening the window.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you're making it earlier, the weigh-ins for the fighters,
right.
but the 10-point system, that's more complicated because if you want to change it, you have to come up with something
It is more complicated,
new.
but his point is, and I think it's correct, right, where you're talking about, guys get up on the stage and they weigh in and they flex and they look terrible. When you get a bad decision, that affects your career too. You took all that damage and then you lose, it affects your purse. That's equally, if not more damaging. Now, I agree. Fixing the 10-point must system.
It's a big deal, and it's coming up with a new one. It's also a lot harder.
I just don't want to hear anyone say, well, even if we had a good idea, what will we do with it? I know what we can do with it. We can go state by state with the UFC pushing it, athletic commissions working hand in hand. We can do this. This is a very solvable problem in terms of that. All right, one more before we get out of here. We have a few minutes left. Okay, how many times, just a question for the panel, how many times have you wanted to walk into the ocean the last week with the UFC is for sale, the UFC's not for sale, TMZ's weighing in on this? How many times have you wanted TMZ to walk into the ocean? Danny, I don't even know what to ask except, where do you stand on the media reports about this? We have guys internally who worked on the story who we don't report anything because we don't have enough information to really make a report. I guess I'd ask you from what's out there, are you bothered or annoyed by this assertion denial?
Yeah, certainly. As a journalist, you're reading all reports, and it's very confusing. And for something like this, say if it's a fight, you know where to go, you know who to ask. But for something of this magnitude, it's really hard to get information. So yeah, it is very confusing and annoying, all these reports coming in. But from what it looks like, Flow Combat reported that it is for sale, and it seems they have some sources there that they say that. So I would like to lean towards that direction as opposed to the TMZ report.
Yeah, Jeremy Botter was the one who reported this for Flow Combat, and I'm inclined to believe him. But certainly the UFC, Jeff, has made a point of saying he's dead wrong.
Well, not just that. If they want to say he's dead wrong and deny, it would not be the first time that the UFC denied a report that turned out to be true within moments.
Right.
We certainly have. We've seen that. We've seen that. Yes, we've seen that in some more times than we care to talk about now. But they also sent Botter a letter from a lawyer, basically a cease and desist. So they're really trying to bully. They're trying to bully a reporter who's pursuing a news story.
They didn't threaten him legally. I think it just said govern your actions accordingly.
Yes,
right.
Which is basically bullying him, but without, in the gentlest way, I guess.
Right.
I guess the strangest part of this whole thing, like you mentioned, wanting to walk in the ocean, it's just that you you live in a state of anticipation of not knowing exactly how this thing is going to work, how it will look down the line. You feel like it's inevitable, I think. Like, I feel like it's inevitable that it's going to sell, or maybe it possibly already is if we go by that flow report.
Yeah.
But it just, you stay in the state of like, we don't know. We just don't know what this is going to be like. What will happen? What does that even mean? Like, how will this all play out? And I think that's sort of the annoying part of it, is just the not knowing how this is all going to play out.
I hope that, there's many reasons why I hope the Flow Combat report is true, not least of which is that the UFC, if what was reported was like, let's say, entirely accurate down to the letter, right? And there were some things there was some ambiguity in the report, but for the things that they asserted in the report, I'm hoping it's true, just for the fact that like the UFC may finally be like, okay, I guess we can't control the narrative anymore, right? I guess we can't be like, don't publish this anymore. We're already on the back, so we know what happened before UFC 199, and now this. I feel like they may not be connected at all, but if they are in fact connected, this like we don't want reporters getting the jump on us. I'm hoping that they'll just be like, okay, if we can't control that, we can't control anything. That's my only hope.
Well, then we're out of here. That's basically the idea. Is we can't control the narrative, so see you later, we're selling. I mean, that is almost as though, I know that's not the cause and effect here
Right.
in reality, but that's the best perception I can come up with, because they do try to treat the media as though it is an arm of their PR team. And we've had this, I don't think we discussed this too much when Ariel was here, because he was a victim of that as well. But now they're doing the same thing, with Bellator and Flow Combat. They say, we're the ones who are making the news, so we're also going to be the ones who are going to let everybody in the world know about the news. And you people out there who are trying to report things and find your own sources, don't do that. Govern your actions, which means, don't look into anything. And that's just not the way things work.
Spoken like a guy who shows up a journalist dressed in quotes all the time.
This guy. All right, before we get out of here, want to say, I don't know who made the video.
Oh, yeah.
There's a video that came out last week where I'm sitting here, Ariel's sitting here, Jeff and then Chuck are talking, and I'm doing one of these numbers, thinking about, I don't know, I guess walking into the ocean over the UFC sale. And they played it to the sound of silence with Simon and Garfunkel. It was hilarious. I showed it to my wife, and she thought it was hysterical. So whoever made that, Jeff, I literally cannot possibly tell you what I was doing in that moment.
I just was waiting for the moment when I went like this, and suddenly
The only positive benefit from that was I wasn't caught mouth breathing. That's the only thing I can say that worked out for me in the end. Anyone got any other shout outs? We're all good here, ready to rock?
Shout out your son's Instagram.
Yeah, you want to shout out your son's Instagram?
My son is here somewhere. I don't know where he went to, but
Before the show, his son's like, can you shout out my Instagram on your show? I'm like, yeah, this is a hip hop radio station. Yeah, you can do that, sure. All right, for Ariel, who's not here, I think we'll be back next week.
I think
yes?
he said he would, yeah.
Just want to make sure about that. If not, well, blame Chuck. I don't know what else to do. For Chuck, for Jeff, for Danny, I am Luke. We'll see you guys next week. Hands up, chin down, let them fly. This is the MMA Beat.